Well, hello there. You're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Time to see what's making the headlines with the columnist and broadcaster Steve Richards and the former Conservative Special Advisor Salma Shah. Great to see both of you. As ever, to the front pages first. The Metro has word of a deal between the government and health unions, which would, if NHS staff vote for it, give them a 5% pay rise. The Eye suggests it could bring an end to the many strikes which have taken place in recent months. The Express calls it a victory for common sense and for patients. Nurses deal at last. That's the front page of the Mirror. While the Sun simply says, carry on, nurse. The Times says unions are backing the pay offer for 1 million NHS staff because they regard it as fair. In the wake of the budget, The Telegraph says Labour is planning a raid on people's pension pots if it wins the next general election and will scrap the extra relief the Chancellor announced for pensions in the budget yesterday. The Financial Times reporting on fears for banks around the world in the wake of the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank and the measures being taken to keep them afloat. The Guardian has seen a report due to be published next week, which is expected to say that the Metropolitan Police has systemic problems with racism, sexism and homophobia, while the Star examines the sleeping habits of younger people. Well, a quick reminder, by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. So let's head straight to our guests then, Steve Richards and Salma Shah. Salma, NHS deal, pay deal, all the details in the papers. Many people asking, you know, parts of this were suggested in advance, like the one-off payment for this year. Why couldn't the government have done this ages ago?
I think that there was definitely that space that they needed to have in order to have the negotiation on pay, and also trying to understand possibly what their financial position was, as we saw from the budget this week. And I think, you know, as Steve is going to point out, there is still no clarity as to where this money is going to come from that is even going to deal with this pay deal, 5% increase and a one-off payment of £1,250. So there are lots of moving parts in this that I think didn't necessitate having come to this conclusion earlier on. And let's not forget, the government didn't start at the place that they've gotten to. And certainly for nurses who are asking for a 19% increase, this is a long way down from what they had initially started with in terms of negotiation.
Yes, and one union, as we know, out of the 14 negotiating with the Health Secretary, not recommending this to their staff because it's a one-off payment, although there will be a permanent 5% pay rise for all effectively for 2023 to 24. But Steve, as you are going to point out, where does the money come from?
I think this becomes a key question because I think Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt in their interviews have sort of said vaguely, well, the NHS has got a generous settlement this year, implying these pay rises will come from that settlement, that there will be no additional money to pay for it. Now, if that's the case, there will be, one of my favourite words in politics, consequences. One of them being that money that people assumed was going to be focused on other things, some of it won't be. It will now go towards this pay rise. So it's not entirely clear tonight where that money is going to come from. But the indications are from the sort of public comments that it's going to come from the existing settlement without additional funding.
But not from patient-facing work that the NHS does, is what we were being told this evening, Steve.
Yeah, but these are very loose definitions. So if not there, you know, it's often said, oh, there can be savings in inverted commas. No doubt there can be, but whether they can be on this scale without impacting on patient-facing NHS work is, I think, at least doubtful. And so I think more detail needs to come out. And there are other questions why this could not have been done earlier. Given the fact that, you know, once this proposition was put together, as you say, it's not certain that people are going to vote for it. But, you know, given that most unions are recommending that they do, there's been months of disruption, and this could have been sorted much earlier.
Yes, Matthew Taylor, Chief Executive of the NHS Confederation, warned that the health service did not have a couple of £1 billion lying around to cover the new pay deal offer, suggesting that he thought the gap between the amount of money the NHS budgeted to spend and how much the pay offer will cost is around £2 billion. And there'll be more negotiations, we understand, between the Treasury and the Department of Health and Social Care. But the newspapers are celebrating to some extent, aren't they? The Metro, for example, say yes to end the strikes. You know, the fact that 13 out of 14 unions, Salma, are recommending this to staff, partly because they won't have to wait for surety of knowledge until the industry body recommends what the pay will be, and the government finally accepted, I think, in July last year, so it'll be months of waiting to find out. So they think this gives staff at least some confidence in knowing how they budget them for themselves next year.
Yeah, and I think this is the thing about the one-off payment that has been suggested for the NHS for this year before the permanent 5% rise comes in, because it is about that whole thing that we're all sort of talking about, which is the cost of living crisis. And even though the government's now got an inflation under control, well, inflation has come under control, there is still that question that prices actually don't fall as a consequence of it. They just slow. So there is that sort of worry that it's probably going to be in a lot of people's minds about how they are going to, fulfill paying for their energy bills and their shopping costs, etc. But I would just say that, alongside that sort of inflationary prediction, I can see why the government wanted to consider, everything in the round before they settled on this pay deal. And I think the reason why newspapers are quite positive about it is because we all want to feel like there's going to be some good news at the end of this, especially with public services where so many people are dependent on their healthcare.
Yes, unions back. Fair raise for 1 million NHS staff. Ballots in next month on this 5% pay rise. It's not over, though, is it? Plenty of industrial action is still out there, Steve, including the suggestion possibly that passport staff might go on strike too. So, do you sense a change in mood, that people are coming to, settlements now and everybody wants this over?
Well, not yet. I don't know how all your weekend plans are being affected. Mine's been completely disrupted by the train action on Saturday, and others will be in the same position. And as you just, I've just heard about this passport threat. So, no, this could go one of two ways, and I genuinely don't know which way it will go. That others note that they have reached a settlement, and others try and do the same quite quickly. And this happened a lot in the 70s, unions say, well, hold on a second, they've got this deal. What about us? And so I'm not at all sure tonight this means it's the end of these waves of strikes.
The FT as well, NHS strikes on hold after unions agree to recommend a pay offer to members. And they are reporting here that more than 1,000 workers in passport offices in England, Scotland and Wales plan to walk out for 5 weeks in April and May. That's according to the PCS union. So the paper reporting that news there. And at The Sun, Salma, carry on nurse. Health unions last night back to 5% pay rise for next year. They halted strike action. The deal also gives NHS staff a 2% rise on last year's settlement. Do you think they'll say yes, staff? What's your feeling?
Well, I hope so. And because it's backed by, union leaders, presumably there is confidence as a result of that this is a fair deal. And, as you pointed out, the Times leads with that word fair, that the union leaders have decided that this is what they can get at this present moment in time. But just to build on Steve's point about, the continuation of strikes, indeed, there is an issue within the NHS because junior doctors don't seem to be part of this. And whilst they're being asked to hold off on further strikes, this does not include them. This is nurses' pay deal. But the strikes in lots of other areas, aside from the passport office, are not negotiations with the government. So rail strikes, for example, are negotiations with a private company, which the government does not have the same kind of leverage over. And certainly the teachers' strike as well is going to be something that comes back. So we are going to have to wait and see whether this means that there is going to be certainty and clarity for the rest of the year, or whether this is just going to create more tension intervention in those other areas in the public sector where the government does have some say on that pay deal.
Yes, and we have to remember that the majority of schools in England closed their doors to some pupils during teacher strikes, over 2 days. Tens of thousands of members of the National Education Union walking out for 2 consecutive days of strike action on Wednesday and Thursday this week in that long-running dispute over pay too. I think they were asked, weren't they, to suspend strikes in England, but they said that the NEU refused until the Education Secretary made a pay offer which could end the dispute. So that's still ongoing. Meantime, a quote from the GMB National Secretary, Steve, Rachel Harrison, saying the government had gone from refusing to talk about pay this year to putting an extra £2.5 billion on the table. GMB members should rightly be proud of themselves. It's been a tough road, but they faced down the Department of Health and won an offer that we feel is the best that can be achieved at this stage through negotiation. The point, I suppose, is that inflation is falling, from about mid-year onwards, isn't it?
And we seem to be getting the figure of the cost of this, 2.5 billion, 2.2 billion, according to Matthew Taylor. And remember, the extra money that has already been announced for the NHS was meant to be meeting the huge backlog that arose over COVID. It's meant to be dealing with staff shortage crises. Now, suddenly, 2 billion of it is to apparently meet the cost of this pay demand. And, so I think the implications of that are pretty big. I mean, it's quite a big sum, 2 billion, 2.5 billion. And it looks as if it's not going to come from the government in terms of additional money.
OK, well, we'll see what happens when it's presented to staff. Keep an eye on what they do and elsewhere in industrial action as well. But let's move on to the front of the Financial Times, talking about banks. And 2 big things today, as they said, struggling banks on both sides of the Atlantic were racing to reassure clients. First of all, Credit Suisse. Executives spent the day calling clients to reassure them that it had been shored up. And secondly, another bank in the United States being propped up by the big Wall Street lenders to the tune of $30 billion. So lots of money being pummeled into the banking sector. Salma, do you think reassurance is the name of the game right now?
Well, absolutely. And if you're reading the FT piece, which is obviously sort of the go-to newspaper for the financial world, a very sort of big financier called Larry Fink, who runs a big hedge fund, is talking about the fact that this is going to be an issue of confidence. And it's probably too soon to liken it to the last financial crash, but I think that experience being so sort of fresh in people's memories is definitely going to be somewhere where people draw comparisons. And it is about what happens with smaller banks and the fact that the Silicon Valley Bank, now Credit Suisse, now another bank in the US is facing this kind of run on its deposits. So we are now having to watch and wait and see actually whether there is contagion from what's happening in these small banks to some of the bigger institutions and what that is actually going to mean for the average person, not just businesses that have invested.
Yeah, all sorts of high-level meetings today in Switzerland with the Swiss government and their regulator and their national bank, the Fed in America watching Credit Suisse, JP Morgan Chase, one of those banks that drove the support for the first the American bank that was propped up today, also commenting, Steve, on Credit Suisse. Analysts there saying that the latest developments at Credit Suisse meant the status quo was no longer an option and a state-sponsored merger with UBS was a likely solution. UBS indicating it's not so happy about that suggestion. But, these banks are being propped up to the tune of tens of billions of dollars now.
Yeah, and they do have, I remember so well, I'm not saying it's going to happen again, but it does have echoes of that early period in the build-up to the 2008 financial crash, where you heard about relatively obscure banks at the beginning failing in some form or another and needing to be rescued in some form or another. And as Salma suggested, the key word here is contagion in 2 different forms, whether it spreads to other banks and whether investors panic, as seemed to have happened to some extent already. Now, on the upside, you could say, well, rescue packages have been quickly put into place. But to some extent, to be honest, at the beginning of the 2008 crash, that happened. Do you remember in this country, the year before that crash, Northern Rock got into deep trouble? but the government moved in and took it over in effect. So who knows what's going to happen next? But it is a nervy moment, and that last crash, Gordon Brown described it as the first crisis of the global economy because it spread across the world, and obviously, if that were to happen again, we're in deep trouble. But
it feels like we have with the pandemic and the energy crisis from the war in Ukraine. It feels like we've had a few crises, does it not? But $54 billion for Credit Suisse, $30 billion for this First Republic Bank, and still the European Central Bank decided to increase interest rates today. We've got a decision next week here. Will it slow the path of interest rate increases, do you think? What's happened, Salma?
Potentially. I mean, I'm not an economist, so I wouldn't want to try and predict what the Bank of England's going to do in terms of interest rates. But I also think that one of the difficulties about this is that, when you are talking about an issue of confidence and consumer confidence, and when you're looking at the fiscal picture that we've just had from the budget, it does give you a sense of sort of nervousness about, what exactly governments and in the International Monetary Fund and international central banks could do, given all these other pressures that they've just had, whether it is the pandemic or war in Ukraine and all the pressures that is putting on supply chains. How much money is there really around there to be able to bail out banks again? So I think this is going to be kind of one of those things that's sitting in the bank of financial centers across the world is kind of, are we going to maintain that confidence? And is plugging the gaps in the way that the Treasury did with the UK branch of SVB over the weekend quite successfully. Is that going to be enough? Or, is it, as Steve says, kind of reminiscent of what happened with Northern Rock all those years ago? It's not something that I can predict, unfortunately. If I could, I'd probably be somewhere else working in the city probably. But I think this is kind of a very nervous moment for a lot of people in the sector.
You'd be George Soros or something like that, wouldn't you? And probably not talking to us at this point. Salma, Steve, say there. Lots more still. Yes, exactly. Lots more still to discuss, including after the break. More on the downing of an American drone by a Russian fighter jet and the news of jets potentially going to Ukraine too. Back with that in just a moment. Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me once again, Steve Richards and Salma Shah. Welcome back to both of you. Certainly some dramatic pictures on the front pages and inside too of the footage released today of the moment these two Russian jets over the Black Sea downed this US drone, Steve. Amazing picture there, as you can see. Now, Russia denied it. We now know not to believe Russia again, don't we?
Yeah, and I gather these drones contain sensitive information, and as you say, the pictures are very dramatic, and it's an example, really, of how things seem to be escalating. Sometimes we've done this press preview when it looked as if Ukraine was on the edge of some sort of decisive triumph. But even then, I was posed the question, well, what form does victory take and what form does defeat take for Russia? And actually what you're seeing here is, and by the way, on another page on the Metro where they've got these photos, there's talk of, American sources saying Putin would be willing to press the nuclear trigger. Now, again, who knows? You have to be in his mind, and maybe he himself isn't fully in his mind. But it just shows that this is going to go on and on for a long time.
And we know Ukrainians' neighbours have taken this very seriously. James Cleverly in Moldova today, and also the Poles, which makes the front of the Financial Times, being the first effectively to break ranks and offering the Ukrainians MiG-29 fighter jets. That's a MiG-29 fighter jet which takes part in a NATO exercise in Poland last October. But the decision to go it alone has been extraordinary, hasn't it, for Poland, which has been a staunch ally, certainly, of the Ukrainians. Salma, I think you might be muted. Oh, Salma's muted, I think. Are you?
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Sorry, yeah.
Sorry. I think the interesting thing about this is that obviously we have as you say, this break from NATO of Poland's, because obviously they are so close to the action. They are on the border, and they are getting an influx of refugees. I think they're seeing so much more of the impact firsthand of this war, and we are still all slightly distanced from it. I think what's fascinating about this is that obviously the Ukrainians want American jets. They're not trained to fly American jets. I think this would put them back in terms of being able to achieve what they want to. But you're right, this could be seen as a big escalation. But having the American jets coming over, I think, would be a bigger issue for Russia and what's going to happen in terms of the stepped increase in this conflict. So whilst Poland is breaking away from it, I think within that sending of the jets over to Ukraine, there is a nuance that at least they're not American jets, and therefore hoping that it's not going to be the same level of escalation if that had taken place.
Yes, in the words of the Polish president, Andrzej Duda, in the coming days we're handing over 4 aircraft in full working order, adding that an unspecified number of additional jets would be sent later. As you said, analysts suggesting that F-16s, US-made F-16s, would require months of training. And, they need it now, don't they? Head to the Daily Star for a final bit of news, which is that our young people are exhausted, Steve.
Yeah, well, I'm feeling pretty fresh now, and I'm very youthful. So I don't fit that headline. Actually, apparently we do, because if we're feeling lively, that's what our generation is all about. And it's these young people who can't keep up because they're sleeping all the time. It explains a lot. Explains our low productivity level in Britain. Come on. We're still
These are 18 to 24-year-olds, many who haven't entered the workplace. Anyway, apparently Generation Z, half of Generation Z have at least one nap a day. 17% of under 24s are so tired they need to doze off twice. Let's hope they're not right now. Anyway.